This is Dan Russell, author of Strategic Suicide and Shamanism and the Drug Propaganda, both available on Amazon Kindle and paperback. The drug war was born in the enslavement process of the ancient world. That is, there was no conception of a male supreme deity prior to the invention of chattel slavery, prior to the military organization of Neolithic tribal communities into the first great industrial slave states, the so-called first great civilizations. We have been Homo sapiens for about 200,000 years, and until about 7,000 years ago, all human culture conceived of the supreme deity as female, not male, and equated that great mother with the central herbal sacrament of the tribe. The forcible domestication of a tribe, enslavement, works by demonizing the tribe's culture, by replacing the communal tribal shamanism with the mandatory slave state substitute, which stresses obedience and submission as a spiritual value, rather than the spontaneous creativity of the archaic techniques of herbal ecstasy. But the replacement is subtle. The drug propaganda works because it's rooted in the archetypes of the collective unconscious. The central sacrament of all Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age cultures known is an inebriative herb, a plant totem, which became metaphoric of the communal epiphany. These herbs, herbal concoctions, and herbal metaphors are at the heart of all mythologies. They include such familiar images as the burning bush, the tree of life, the cross, the golden bough, the forbidden fruit, the blood of Christ, the blood of Dionysus, the Holy Grail, the chalice, which means flower cup in Greek, the golden flower, ambrosia, nectar, the sacred lotus, the golden apples, the mystic mandrake, the mystic rose, the divine mushroom, mama coca, and peyote woman. There is nothing dangerous in the legal sense about most traditional inebriative herbs. In fact, the Native American coca chewers of the high Andes are famous as the centenarians of the Andes, some of the most long-lived people in the world, despite the grinding poverty fascism has inflicted on them. Obviously, cocaine, the artificial concentrate, isolated in 1860, is a surgical tool, a powerful local anesthetic capable of hypodermic injection. Hypodermic injection of the isolate cannot be analogized with the traditional culinary use of the whole leaf. At the turn of the century, an alcoholic extract of whole coca leaves, mixed with good French wines, was the best-selling tonic wine in the world, Van Mariani. It was happily lauded to the skies in Mariani's full-page ads by the likes of Thomas Edison, Jules Verne, Pope Leo XIII, Queen Victoria, Sarah Bernhardt, Émile Zola, Charles Gounod, and Bartholdi, sculptor of the Statue of Liberty. Mariani insisted that he used the traditional alcoholic infusion of whole coca leaves. He claimed never to have used isolated cocaine. Mariani was world famous as a connoisseur of coca leaves. Their distinctions in the Andes were as sharp as the distinctions between French wines. Many of Mariani's imitators, of course, made no bones about adding indiscriminate amounts of refined cocaine and sugar to cheap wine. This helped organized medicine to engineer a legal monopoly on the enormous tonic wine business. They were enabled to define the leaf, in law, as dangerous as an overdose of the alkaloid, and therefore available only by prescription. Freud's 1884 essay on coca popularized the use of cocaine for short-term stimulation, treatment of asthma, as an aphrodisiac, and as a maintenance therapy in alcohol and opiate addiction, and as a local anesthetic. Freud's colleague in Vienna, Karl Kohler, reinvented eye surgery with it, since cocaine was the first surgically effective local anesthetic. Kohler's monumental 1884 discovery led to a revolution in general surgery the next year, with the invention of spinal block anesthesia using cocaine. Cocaine, a powerful local anesthetic, made an excellent swab for teething pain. Rare indeed was the parent who made baby guzzle the stuff, but seizing on the rare examples of hysterical or untrained overdosage, organized medicine proceeded to exaggerate the dangers of cocaine and to paint every other medically effective herb and isolate with the same brush. They had found, as the American Journal of Pharmacy put it in 1903, their devil drug. Instead of the traditional herbs, we got the Saturday Evening Post in 1929 joyfully reporting that 75 years ago there were no drugs to relieve headaches and similar pains except dangerous habit-forming opiates. Now there's a wide variety of relatively harmless drugs, such as coal tar derivatives. Since isolated coal tar derivatives can't be grown in anyone's garden, their permutations can be patented. That's why they're safe. Negro cocaine fiends are a new southern menace, screamed Dr. Edward H. Williams in the New York Times, February 8, 1914, while the Harrison Act was in committee. Old Doc Williams didn't let the facts stand in his way, but I believe the record of the cocaine nigger near Asheville, who dropped 5 men dead in their tracks using only 1 cartridge for each, offers evidence that is sufficiently convincing. 9 men killed in Mississippi on one occasion by crazed cocaine takers, 5 in North Carolina, 3 in Tennessee. These are facts that need no imaginative coloring. And since this gruesome evidence is supported by the printed records of insane hospitals, police courts, jails, and penitentiaries, there is no escaping the conviction that drug taking has become a race menace in certain regions south of the line. It seems to me that, from the black perspective, the achievements of the cocaine nigger were an endorsement of cocaine. The persistence of racism in American culture is largely unconscious, that is, rooted in the inquisitorial neurosis, hostility to tribal culture, and the police state fascism of the drug war. For those who think that the rationale of American drug law isn't inherently racist and anti-tribal, or that it's different than the industrial fascism of alcohol prohibition, we have the KKK-supported Representative Richmond P. Hobson of Alabama. In the 1920s, Hobson was the most famous anti-heroin crusader in the country. In 1911, Hobson was the man who introduced what became the 18th Amendment, alcohol prohibition, in Congress. One of the prohibitionists' favorite lies is that drug prohibition and alcohol prohibition are separate issues engineered by separate forces. They were, in fact, part and parcel of the same political program engineered by exactly the same individuals, most of them anti-black racists. The KKK's Representative Hobson of Alabama was the Anti-Saloon League's most popular and highest paid speaker. The assumptions of his astounding arguments are all written into today's drug law. Here are some excerpts from his February 2, 1911 speech introducing what became, in 1918, the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. History is a record of a sad procession of world tragedies. Nations and empires in turn have risen to greatness only to fall. Before the death blow was struck from without, the evidence shows in every case the ravages of a titanic destroyer within, under whose operations the vitality and strength of the nation were submerged in a general degeneracy. If a peaceable red man is subjected to the regular use of alcoholic beverage, he will speedily be put back to the plane of the savage. The government long since recognized this and absolutely prohibits the introduction of alcoholic beverage into an Indian reservation. If a Negro takes up a regular use of alcoholic beverage, in a short time he will degenerate to the level of the cannibal. No matter how high the stage of evolution, the result is the same. In our great cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, the ravages upon the average character have been so great, so many degenerates have already been produced, that the degenerate and corruptible vote not only holds the balance of power between the two great political parties and can dictate to both, but actually holds a majority of the votes, so that honest and efficient self-government as a permanent condition is now impossible. Immigrants coming in vast numbers from abroad remain chiefly in the cities. As young as our nation is, the deadly work of alcohol has already blighted liberty in our greatest cities. If America degenerates, the yellow man will be on hand. Some may make light of the yellow man. So did the Romans make light of the barbarians. The yellow man is not degenerating. He can shoot as straight as a white man now, and undegenerated, he can live on 1/10 of what is necessary for the white men while they are in the field doing the shooting. A race of degenerates cannot occupy the American continent. In America, we are making the last stand of the great white race and substantially of the human race. If this destroyer cannot be conquered in young America, it cannot in any of the old and more degenerate nations. If America fails, the world will be undone, and the human race will be doomed to go down from degeneracy into degeneracy, till the Almighty in wrath wipes the accursed thing out. God, they loved him in Alabama. In the 1920s, he founded the International Narcotic Education Association, with a board of directors of prominent industrialists and an advisory council of cabinet secretaries, governors, mayors, district attorneys, bishops, and ambassadors, but not one reputable drug abuse expert. Having gotten his alcohol prohibition, he decided that the fate of the race rested on defeat of the new great destroyers, all herbal and refined inebriants, advocating precisely the policies we now have in place: draconian law enforcement combined with unrelenting propaganda. We need to preach the gospel of narcotic abstinence from the pulpit, to flash it on the screen, to enact it on the stage, to proclaim it from the public platform, to depict it in the press, and above all, to teach it in our schools. All constructive social agencies will help in fighting this peril, in setting up in the minds of all the same abhorrence that is felt for a venomous snake. All the measures Hobson advocated for the inner cities are now law. Our prisons are full of exactly the people Hobson thought belonged there. We don't say nigger anymore, of course. We say drug dealer. So much more scientific. Hobson stopped saying nigger, too. In Good Housekeeping, the progressive Dr. Wiley worried about Negro peddlers. In the yellow press, the single most common synonym for nigger was drug dealer or addict, as in the sharpshooter from Asheville. These words are racist code to this day. The Nigger, a popular 1910 Broadway play, believe it or not, was typical of the traveling temperance shows that ran all over the country between 1880 and 1920. The scene is the Deep South. Our hero is Phil Morrow, owner of the local big plantation and county sheriff. Our villain is Cliff Noyes, owner of Noyes Distillery Works and Phil's childhood friend. There is a subplot of competition between the two for the hand of Miss Georgiana, but she rejects Distiller Cliff as easily as I'd kick a nigger downstairs, and marries Phil after the first act. The distiller has come to Phil's plantation to persuade its blue blood owner to run for governor against the progressive nigger-loving carpetbagger prohibitionist who threatens to turn the state dry. Just as he accepts Cliff's offer, a deputy runs breathlessly up to Phil to inform him that it's a nigger, sir, the usual crime, the rape murder of a little white girl in the woods. The rapist, an habitual drunk, is one of Phil's plantation hands, so Phil gets his hands on him before the lynch mob, led by the murdered girl's father. Law and Order Phil adamantly refuses to turn the black beast over to the mob, insisting that he must be hanged legally. Distiller Cliff warns that this action will endanger the anti-nigger vote, but Phil refuses to relent. Just then the rapist bolts, the mob gets him, and the anti-nigger vote is saved at the end of a rope. Once in the State House, Phil is confronted with a prolonged race riot down in the Levee District. Explains Phil to the horrified distiller, "This volcano's helped me along considerable. We brought the niggers over to this country, Cliff, and I reckon we're responsible for them while they're here. If we've kept them like children, we've got to treat them like children, and we're not in the habit, Cliff, of pouring liquor down the throats of our infants. Why, day before yesterday I had a count made, and there were 3,467 idle niggers in the 59 saloons of the Levee District. That was the end, Cliff, and the long and the short of it is, we're going dry." As Representative Edward Pugh of North Carolina explained on the floor of Congress in 1914, the South prohibits black voting not out of hatred, but as the adult takes the pistol from the hand of the child. Legally speaking, of course, we're all the nigger, all children too stupid to take herbs our Paleolithic ancestors knew how to use. As corporate hitman Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, put it in 1928 in Propaganda, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. Bernays understood the commercial manipulation of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew. DuPont used Bernays' propaganda prescription to engineer the outlawing of hemp. Hemp cellulose was DuPont's original raw material for rayon, the first patented synthetic fiber. DuPont's idea was to replace hemp with its patented synthetic fibers. Marijuana, hemp, was one of America's most valuable crops in 1900. Much of the country's textiles, canvas, sails, rope, paper, paints, industrial solvents, lighting oil, machine oil, food oil, and medicine was made from it. Marijuana was the raw material for fire hoses, ship's rigging, fine linen, work clothes, good paper, candy, bread, birdseed, and cheap energy. The first American pot law, passed by the Virginia Assembly in 1619, actually required every farmer to grow it, since hemp rigging and caulking were deemed a strategic necessity. The Declaration of Independence and most of America's pre-Civil War books were printed on combination hemp-flax paper. Tens of thousands of acres were in regular production. In the 1930s, Henry Ford had terrified his fellow industrialists by demonstrating that methanol from easy-to-grow hemp could replace gasoline. An acre of hemp yields 1,000 gallons of clean-burning methanol, and it's far cheaper to make. In Popular Mechanics, December 1941, Ford's test car body itself was made from the tough hemp fiber, wheat straw, sisal, and resin binder. The gasoline, sheet metal, synthetic fiber, and plastics industries were not amused by the car Henry Ford grew from the soil. They knew Ford was dangerous enough to invent them out of business. DuPont used hemp to make not only rayon, but dynamite and TNT. DuPont supplied 40% of the explosives for the Allies during World War I and is today's leading synthetic fiber manufacturer. Hoover's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, through the Mellon Bank of Pittsburgh, was the major financial backer of DuPont and Hearst. Secretary Mellon engineered the legal destruction of the hemp industry. The first DEA, the Narcotics Division of the Prohibition Unit of the Treasury Department, was founded and funded by the Volstead Act of 1919, the enabling act of the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. The charter of the Narcotics Division, of course, was the State Department's Harrison Act of 1914, an original part of Prohibition's political package. The Harrison Narcotics Act was originally the responsibility of Treasury's Alcohol Tax Division, but went largely unenforced until the Volstead Act of 1919 funded the Prohibition Unit and its subdivision, the Narcotics Division, the first DEA. The first chief of the Narcotics Division, Levi Nutt, held that job for 10 years. But in 1930, Treasury Secretary Mellon appointed an Assistant Commissioner of Prohibition specializing in diplomacy, Harry Anslinger, to head Treasury's reorganized Bureau of Narcotics. Treasury's hopelessly corrupt Prohibition Unit was transferred to the Department of Justice. One of the straws that forced this reorganization reveals the actual dynamics of the situation. The indictment of Narcotics Chief Levi Nutt and most of his New York division by a New York grand jury for being on the Rothstein, Lansky, Luciano payroll. Nutt took over the Narcotics Division in 1920 under exactly the same circumstances. When the legendary gambler Arnold Rothstein was murdered by one of Dutch Schultz's hitters named McManus in 1928, his dying body was found with a small fortune in opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine, and all his carefully kept legal books, including the history of his relationship with Nutt. The rabid prohibitionist Nutt started his tenure as head of the Narcotics Division in 1920, with his son listed as Rothstein's attorney of record for tax matters with the Treasury Department, and his son-in-law operating as Rothstein's New York accountant and attorney. It was Nutt's boss, Secretary Mellon, who ordered Anslinger to engineer the Reefer Madness campaign that laid the political foundation for the criminalization of the entire hemp industry with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The criminal-governmental symbiosis is a two-way street. If marijuana were legalized, the hood monopoly would be broken, and marijuana would lose 95% of its value. The Great Hoods, geniuses at organizing street muscle, were for Prohibition, and Assistant Commissioner of Prohibition Anslinger, the Mellon DuPont operative, was one of their major allies, operating the side of the street they couldn't independently run. Alcohol and drug prohibitionist Anslinger, like his soulmate J. Edgar Hoover, was in bed with the Mellon, Hearst, Annenberg syndicate hoods from the beginning. Anslinger always regarded drug prohibition as a tool for social reorganization, fearing communist unions far more than syndicate heroin gangs, who were, after all, Mellon, DuPont's, Hearst, and Annenberg's patriotic strikebreakers. They were also J. Edgar Hoover's most dangerous operatives, right from the murderous Palmer raids of 1919, which Hoover organized. J. Edgar Hoover pioneered the well-publicized destruction of kingpins, brilliantly throwing a blanket of PR over his ineffectiveness and corruption. Hoover used the same ghostwriter as Harry Anslinger, former circus press agent Courtney Riley Cooper, the man who coined the phrase reefer madness. Cooper wrote flashy magazine stories dramatizing J. Edgar's fictitious personal encounters with America's most wanted. In 1939, Hoover decided that Lepke Buckhalter was the most dangerous man in America. This momentous decision was forced on J. Edgar when Lepke got himself indicted in 1937 for importing huge amounts of Japanese Kuomintang heroin from Tientsin. Although the FBI had nothing to do with the investigation of the indictment, it asked Lepke's partners, Lansky and Luciano, to hand him over to Hoover personally, in the presence of Walter Winchell no less, in exchange for anonymity and protection. Lansky and Luciano wisely complied. It was good for business, and they were wise guys. During the war, the Office of Naval Intelligence had to use Mafia Chief Luciano to secure New York's docks. Too much information was getting through to the deadly U-boats. The U.S. and its allies lost 120 merchant ships to German U-boats off the American coast in the first 3 months after Pearl Harbor. Freight specifics and sailing routes were insecure on the New York docks. The docks weren't run by Luciano, but by Luciano's amici. The capo mafioso wasn't really capo di tutti capi because organized crime wasn't really that organized. It wasn't a corporation with a rigid hierarchy. Luciano could defend his turf where he could, and others could do the same. Many of those weren't Italian, and many chose to remain quite anonymous. But many were Italian or Sicilian, and the old Sicilian structure, the mafia, provided methods whereby an underground economy could be managed. The mafiosi, for all their bloody reputation, were actually quite good at cooperating with one another, and few could touch them for guts, street smarts, and organization. The mafia was needed not just for protection and intelligence on the docks, but to organize Sicily behind Patton. With street-level mafia cooperation, recent Sicilian immigrants, many professional fishermen, were funneled into the New York Office of Naval Intelligence. They helped to refine very accurate maps of the Sicilian coast and hinterland, providing the invasion force with tide tables and the location of docks, key roads, mountain passes, and guerrilla groups. They also provided regular communication with the mafia powers behind German lines in western Sicily. Don Calogero Vizzini and Don Giuseppe Genco Russo, although flexible enough to survive, had been badly weakened by Mussolini's serious attempt to replace their coercive power structures with his own. Knowing that the Americans were unstoppable anyway, they provided a ready-made guerrilla army to roll out the red carpet for the invaders. When Lieutenant Paul Alfieri landed on Licata Beach, his Sicilian contacts were able to give him safe passage to the secret HQ of the Italian Naval Command. Inside, Alfieri found maps of the disposition of all German and Italian naval forces in the Mediterranean. The Mafia put out the word that Italian troops who resisted the Americans would be marked for reprisal, but those that deserted would be given civilian clothes and protection. Italian troops deserted by the truckload. Mafiosi guided Patton's 7th Army through the labyrinthine San Vito Mountains, enabling Patton to split the 400,000 fascist troops in two. These Sicilians were directly responsible for saving thousands of American lives during the 1943 invasion. Unfortunately, this was turned into a political tragedy for Sicily. Sicily's economy was almost entirely agricultural. But until the Land Reform Act of 1950, land wasn't generally passed on in small family plots, but in large latifundia, plantations. Small plots were rented out for shares. The great dons were landlords who violently opposed the efforts of the sharecroppers at land reform. The Allied military government made Don Calogero Vizzini, his successor Genco Russo, and many other mafiosi mayors of important towns. Coordinating the Allied effort was the former lieutenant governor of New York, Colonel Charles Paletti, whom Luciano described as one of our good friends, that is, a made mafioso. Colonel Paletti, military governor of Sicily, made New York's most powerful expatriate mafia capo, Vito Genovese, his official interpreter, thus putting New York organized crime at the very heart of Allied military intelligence in Italy. The CIA used the mafia's allies, the Union Corse, to take Marseille away from the independent and communist unions, leaving the Corsican hoods in control of the most important port in France. The geopolitical rationale for this, from both the French and the American perspective, wasn't only the threat the leftists posed to control of France, but to the Indochina War. The Viet Minh had considerable support among French leftists in 1947. In an attempt to force the French government to negotiate with the Viet Minh, the communist dock worker unions, which were full of former Maquis fighters, refused to load American arms destined for the French in Vietnam. The only outfits with enough muscle to challenge the communist unions for control of the docks and the Marseille City Council were the union-busting Corsican hoods and their puppet union goon squads. The 1947-48 street war for control of Marseille's docks, financed and coordinated by American military intelligence, was nasty, brutish, and short. The French secret services, also financed by American military intelligence, had been using Corsican opium dealers throughout Indochina to finance their operation against the Viet Minh. Thus, they had a system in place for the collection and distribution of opium and morphine base from all over the Golden Triangle of Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Morphine base is easily manufactured in makeshift jungle labs. Opium's major alkaloid is precipitated out of the raw sap by boiling it in water with lime. The white morphine floats to the top. That is drawn off and boiled with ammonia, filtered, boiled again, and then sun-dried. The resultant clay-like brown paste is morphine base. That's where the Corsicans came in. Heroin is diacetyl morphine, morphine in combination with acetic acid, the naturally occurring acid found in vinegar. Heroin is preferred by users because the acetic acid renders it highly soluble in blood, therefore quicker acting and more potent than unrefined morphine. The combination process requires, firstly, the skillful use of acetic anhydride, chloroform, sodium carbonate, and alcohol. Then the last step, purification in the fourth stage, requires heating with ether and hydrochloric acid. Since the volatile ether has a habit of exploding, the Union Corse had to advertise for a few good chemists. With huge protected surpluses of morphine base available, the Corsicans built a network of labs to refine not only the Indo-Chinese, but also the Persian and Turkish products, shipping the finished Snow White No. 4 heroin out of a Marseille they now controlled. The Union Corse heroin was often shipped on the order of their mafia partners, who controlled the great American retail market. With that much leverage, the Corsican hoods became major CIA assets throughout the 50s. Anslinger Star International agents in the 50s, George White, Charles Siragusa, and Sal Vizzini, actually brag in their memoirs about their operational CIA Doxium Bureau connections. That is, as they themselves obliquely admit, their mission was essentially political, with the occasional cosmetic bust thrown in for credibility or to destroy a competing asset. White is the man who pretended that Burmese Kuomintang heroin came from the Reds. Siragusa is the man who caught Luciano with a half-ton of heroin being readied for shipment to Trafficante in Havana and, pursuant to Anslinger's orders, just let him go. The Viet Minh was one of the greatest successes of the OSS during World War II. By 1944, the Viet Minh had taken complete control of the northern Tonkin provinces. They were a military reality. They were feeding the OSS South China Command at Kunming genuine intelligence, supporting its raiding parties, and rescuing its flyers. So we sent them rifles, machine guns, mortars, bazookas, and grenades as they took Vietnam from the Japanese. Ho based the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, September 2, 1945, on the American. OSS Major Archimedes Patty actually helped Ho write it. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Ho was flanked by his American military mission when he read those words to the vast crowd of nearly 1 million gathered in front of the Hanoi Municipal Theater. The American military plane that flew overhead was wildly cheered. That was also the day Japan formally surrendered to the U.S. At this time, Ho repeatedly sent formal offers to the American government through the OSS team attached to him, inviting massive American investment and lucrative government-to-industry partnerships. The War Department responded by sending half the unused Japan invasion stockpiled on Okinawa to Von Nguyen Jap in Hanoi. Enough weaponry, including heavy artillery, for 150,000 troops. Douglas MacArthur had warned Kennedy in the White House in 1961 that a Vietnam War was military suicide. Eisenhower, Shoup, Lemnitzer, Mountbatten, Ridgway, Bradley, Gavin, Prouty, and many others were horrified. They saw us heading for a repeat of the Korean nightmare. They predicted, before it ever happened, 60,000 American dead and a loss. They did not regard that as an option. For American military intelligence, the Vietnam War was, to a very large extent, a drug war. And just as in Cuba, we were the dealers. Oil and other mineral wealth, of course, played a major role, as did the great defense contractor Boondoggle. The Vietnam War was worth $240 billion to defense contractors in overt appropriations, and at least another $300 billion in covert and indirect appropriations. The artificial prohibition-created value of the opium from Laos, Burma, and Thailand became, therefore, a major factor in the Indo-Chinese military equation, the means by which our clients could pay for our arms. Marine Commandant David Shoup, who spearheaded the Marine assault on the Japanese at Tarawa, a Congressional Medal of Honor winning veteran of an awful lot of combat, refused to play this defense contractor boondoggle game. He was livid at the venality that drove this Nazi-like corruption of our military intelligence. He did not forgive the reckless waste of his troopers or Vietnamese lives. He told the 1966 convocation, "I believe that if we would keep our dirty, bloody, dollar-crook fingers out of the business of these nations so full of depressed, exploited people, they will arrive at a solution of their own, that they design and want, that they fight and work for, and not the American style, which they don't want, not one crammed down their throats by the Americans." As the deep rage of so much of the World War II and Korea-era military leadership indicates, they equated lying through your teeth to the commander-in-chief with treason. Strategically speaking, withdrawal was the only option. The Viet Minh had made that point a long time ago. They were the overwhelming majority, therefore there was no military option but to treat them as such. That had always been perfectly clear to American military intelligence. Mainstream critics of the war, ever fearful of media blacklist, obsequiously called our ruthless mass murder an excess of righteousness and disinterested benevolence, and defending the South, or blundering efforts to do good. Only hippie crackpots like Allen Ginsberg, a practicing shaman, insisted that we were doing good by financing mass murder with dope. Time, February 9, 1959, derided Ginsberg for making that claim, but in 1972, the intrepid Alfred W. McCoy proved it was true with the publication of his seminal The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. Wrote McCoy, "It was not only General Ballou who convinced me that the Vietnam drug problem needed investigation. At a street demonstration in New Haven for Black Panther leader Bobby Seale, I met the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who insisted that the CIA was deeply involved in the Southeast Asian opium trade. To back his claims and aid my research, He mailed me a carton containing years' worth of unpublished dispatches from Time Life correspondents that documented the involvement of America's Asian allies in the opium traffic. On June 21, 1970, the Bureau of Narcotics announced the denouement of Operation Eagle, trumpeted as the largest roundup of major drug traffickers in the history of federal law enforcement. 105 of the 150 dealers arrested were Cuban veterans of the Bay of Pigs. Ted Shackley, the blonde ghost, functioned as Santos Traficante's chief requisition officer as head of the CIA's huge Miami station during the early 60s Operation Mongoose, also led by General Lansdale, to overthrow Castro. There he worked hand in glove with CIA agent Joseph Califano, the Richmond P. Hobson of our time. He then transferred to Vientiane, Laos, where he served as CIA station chief from 1966 to 68. There he directed operations for the CIA's Hmong Opium Army. Thomas Clines was Shackley's second in command in Vientiane, with special responsibility for Hmong relations at Lang Tieng. Clines went on to lead both the overthrow of Allende in Chile in 1973 and the Contra War against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Like the Hmong Opium operation in Vietnam, all these efforts were financed with massive organized drug dealing. General Richard Secord conducted their Air America operations, without which there was no Hmong Opium Army. Serving under Secord in Laos was Oliver North. One of Secord's cargo kickers in Laos was Eugene Hassenfuss, whose downplane in Nicaragua, 18 years later, revealed a virtual address book of CIA Contra connections. The arrested Operation Eagle Cuban dealers were defended by Frank Rogano, Santos Traficante's lawyer. Attorney General Mitchell said that this was a nationwide ring of wholesalers handling about 30% of all heroin and 75 to 80% of all cocaine sales in the United States. Operation Eagle is yet another example of poor communications between federal law enforcement and the CIA. Nixon's CIA proceeded to sabotage most of the Eagle's indictments, and nearly all the heroes of Brigade 2506, who had originally been recruited under Vice President Nixon, went right back to work for Don Santos. Nixon's much-touted war on drugs took the media focus off his escalation of the Vietnam War. This included the genocidal B-52 carpet bombing of much of Vietnam and Cambodia, and the simultaneous invasion and overthrow of the neutralist Cambodian government. Nixon's incredible brutality was an attempt to outrun the visceral rage the obvious genocide was producing back home. The drug war was also a way of turning the police loose on the anti-war demonstrators, many of whom considered pot sacramental. If we cannot destroy the drug menace, then it will destroy us. I am not prepared to accept this alternative, intoned President Nixon in June of 1971. That same year, 8 kilos of General Juan Raticon's W.O. Globe Laotian heroin was seized by customs in New Jersey from the U.S. military postal system. A Filipino diplomat was arrested with 15 kilos of W.O. Globe heroin, another with 40 kilos. The son of Panama's ambassador to Taiwan was arrested with 50 kilos, and the Laotian prince, the royal Laotian ambassador to France, was arrested with 60 kilos of W.O. Globe heroin. He had attempted to bring into Paris under his diplomatic pouch. These were all anti-communist allies financed by Richard Nixon. The Laotian prince, Sopsaisana, was the head of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, the chief political advisor of Vang Pao, military commander of the CIA's Laotian Hmong army. The heroin itself was refined from Hmong opium at Lang Tieng, the CIA's headquarters in northern Laos, and given to Sopsaisana on consignment by Vang Pao. The consignment made its way from Vang Pao in Lang Tieng to Sopsaisana in Vientiane via Vang Pao's division of General Secord's Air America. That apparently was an alternative Richard Nixon was willing to accept. In 1961, when the CIA organized 32 C-47s into the first transport group to trade Hmong opium for CIA arms via Ngo Dinh Nhu's distribution apparatus, Colonel Nguyen Cao Ky was its commander. 6 weeks after Diem's 1963 CIA overthrow, the French-trained Key was in command of the entire South Vietnamese Air Force. In June of 1965, Key, who had no political base whatever, became Prime Minister of South Vietnam. In September 1972, Nixon very publicly ordered all U.S. embassies to cooperate with the CIA in the global anti-drug effort. He called staff from 54 embassies back to D.C. to hear him formally order the CIA to engage the slave traders of our time. The practical effect of that, of course, as Nixon well understood, was to give the CIA carte blanche in U.S. embassies throughout the world. These cooperating hoods and businessmen, Marcello, Beebe, Renda, Misher, Lyon, Khashoggi, Murchison, Hellawell, Hernandez-Cartaya, Charles, Rebozo, the Bushes, etc., were indistinguishable from the intelligence community and from the Republican establishment. President Bush's Federal Housing Administration Commissioner, Catherine Austin Fitts, Assistant Secretary of Housing under HUD Secretary Jack Kemp, got a close-up look at the modus operandi of this establishment. During the Reagan years, Fitts was a managing director and board member of the prestigious Wall Street investment bank Dillon Read & Company. As manager of their huge municipal and government portfolios, she oversaw the financing of multi-billion-dollar urban transportation and renewal projects, including the renovation of the New York City subway system. Nicholas Brady, George Bush's Treasury Secretary, was her partner and boss at Dillon Read. Unlike many of her fellow Reaganauts, Fitts was a religiously motivated idealist, not a money-motivated hustler. As Bush's manager of the FHA's gigantic $300 billion mortgage and properties portfolio, she set out to revamp the system from the bottom up, whoever's ox got gored. One of the obvious things Fitts was able to demonstrate was that HUD was often paying its pet contractors $200,000 per housing unit, when perfectly good units were available in the neighborhood for $40,000. But of course, the cheaper local units weren't owned by HUD-connected contractors. Secretary Kemp, fearing for his oxen, fired Commissioner Fitts. Fitz's complaint was that HUD policies did nothing to address neighborhood structural poverty, but rather exacerbated it, with draconian drug testing, eviction, and mortgage foreclosure rules. With her geocoded database, she was able to demonstrate that defaulted HUD mortgages were concentrated in areas of structural poverty, and that those were precisely the drug areas the Republican prohibitionists were most up in arms about. Contra-supplied crack cocaine kingpin Freeway Ricky Ross's Harbor Freeway, running right through the center of South Central LA, was a concentrated mass of defaulted HUD, FHA, single-family loans. Fitz's map of defaults looks quite like a pollution-induced disease cluster centered around the Harbor Freeway. Failure to address neighborhood structural poverty results in a pain-filled neighborhood dependent on the default painkiller economy. The resultant anarchic poverty and violence collapses neighborhood property values. Prime urban real estate can then be bought for pennies on the dollar. And who was buying this prime real estate? The HUD contractors, indistinguishable from the intelligence community and the Republican establishment. The same liquidators that had made the neighborhood ripe for a drug epidemic in the first place, the same military intelligence operatives dealing the drugs, were using their drug money to buy the now devalued neighborhoods for a pittance, for cheap conversion into condos, malls, and industrial parks. These were the very same radical prohibitionists demonizing those using the painkillers and then vying for the resultant prison contracts. On February 11, 1982, 3 months after President Reagan formally authorized covert CIA operations against the Sandinistas in National Security Decision Directive 17, Attorney General William French Smith, at DCI Casey's request, released the CIA from its legal responsibility to report the narcotics law violations of its own contractors. Smith's letter to Casey was published as part of CIA Inspector General Frederick Hitz's January 1998 report to Congress on CIA-Contra drug connections. The letter was read into the congressional record in May of '98 by LA's enraged Representative Maxine Waters, despite the CIA's insistence that the entire report was classified. It is interesting that Smith didn't release the CIA from any of its other responsibilities under federal law, the requirement to report murder, Neutrality Act violations, espionage, arson, but only the requirement to report narcotics law violations. A series of concomitant executive orders and national security decision directives, many of which have been declassified, revealed that Vice President Bush, the former director of the CIA, had formal executive control of all Reagan administration intelligence operations, and was in fact DCI Casey's commanding officer. The setup for Casey's ability to dictate law enforcement to the Attorney General was Reagan's Executive Order number 12333, also dating to November 1981, the week he formally sicked the CIA on the Sandinistas. The new rules required the CIA to approve the Justice Department's crime reporting procedures. Casey's request for the narcotics reporting exemption, then, was more of a legal demand. The Attorney General complied, 2/11/82. Dear Bill, in light of these provisions and in view of the fine cooperation the Drug Enforcement Administration has received from the CIA, no formal requirement regarding the reporting of narcotics violations has been included in these procedures. This legal exemption was an organic part of the initial administration planning for Contra operations, indicating a premeditated conspiracy to do what the Reagan administration actually did: operate a massive, illegal, international drugs for arms network. The Contras, at any rate, had so little popular support they couldn't hold a mountaintop long enough to dig a deep latrine. They could hit and they could run. The CIA, and certainly the State Department, did what it could to patch together a centrist coalition of Nicaraguans who weren't Somocistas, but their coalition had no operational control of their military. 46 of the 48 top Contra leaders were CIA Somocistas, that is, former officers of Somoza's National Guard. The other two apparently just liked killing. An August 1985 incident is typical. When the Contras couldn't hold the town of La Trinidad for more than 5 hours, the time it took Sandinista troops to reach them, they beheaded quite a few townspeople by way of farewell. The Honduran airline Setco, according to Senator Kerry's subcommittee, was the principal company used by the Contras in Honduras to transport supplies and personnel for the FDN. From 1983 through 1985, Setco received funds for Contra supply operations from the Contra accounts established by Oliver North. Setco was run by Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, an agent of the Mexican DFS, who had worked with the legendary Mexican-based CIA Cuban Alberto Cecilia Falcon. Mata, a Honduran chemist, had helped Cecilia set up his Andean cocaine connections. Mata was hunted as a major drug kingpin by the DEA throughout the 70s. The DEA first arrested him in 1970 at Dulles Airport with 54 pounds of cocaine, but that was in his small-time early days. When Cecilia fell, in 1976, Mata inherited much of his network, including a heroin franchise from Guadalajara's great opium grower and heroin manufacturer, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, and a cocaine distribution franchise from the Medellin cartel. Mata and his Guadalajara cartel partners ran the Mexican trampoline that bounced cocaine from Colombia into the U.S. The only short-term threat to this network was the DEA station chief in the Honduran capital Tegucigalpa, Tomas Zepeda, who simply refused to go along. Zepeda went after Honduran strongman Alvarez, his secret police partner Colonel Torres Arias, Mata, and most of the Contra leadership for drug trafficking. The CIA, which had already asked the DEA to define the level of drug trafficking permissible for an asset, proceeded to pull the rug out from under Zepeda. In June of 1983, as the CIA Honduras station doubled in size, the DEA shut down Zepeda's office completely, claiming lack of funds, thus giving the big green light to the key cocaine transshipment center in Latin America. The DEA's Zepeda in the LA Times, 2/13/88, insisted that the CIA intentionally sabotaged his investigation. A 1983 Customs Investigative Report stated that SETCO stands for Servicios Ejecutivos Turistas Commander and is headed by Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, a Class 1 DEA violator. SETCO Aviation is a corporation formed by American businessmen who are dealing with Ballesteros and are smuggling narcotics into the United States. So, armed with this intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, under specific orders, proceeded to set up the bank accounts through which SETCO would be paid for services to the U.S. military. The July 9, 1984 entry in North's diary, obligingly published by Senator Kerry, states, in Ali's own hand, wanted aircraft to go to Bolivia to pick up paste, want aircraft to pick up 1,500 kilos. The July 12, 1985 entry reads, 14 million to finance arms supermarket came from drugs. The August 9, 1985 entry reads, Honduran DC-9, which is being used for runs out of New Orleans, is probably being used for drug runs into the U.S. All told, Ali referred to CIA drug dealing in more than 250 entries. The Iran in Iran-Contra refers to the other illegal financing of the Contras by this operation, the sale of arms to the Iranian fascists. Using the Ayatollah's money to support the Nicaraguan resistance is a neat idea, chirped Ali. Except if you get caught. On March 16, 1988, North, his immediate superior Poindexter, Poindexter's predecessor Robert McFarland, Richard Secord, and Secord's business partner Albert Hakim were indicted for violating the congressional ban on arming the Contras, illegal arms sales, conspiracy, fraud, and theft. It is interesting that the diagram found in North's White House safe, outlining the Contra private aid network, shows many of the same banks and foundations involved in the savings and loan debacle, and also indicted as drug money launderies. All were close political allies of North's commanding officer, Vice President George Bush. Explained Special Prosecutor Walsh, we've created a class of intelligence officer who cannot be prosecuted. Wrote a seething Secretary of State George Shultz, the CIA and the NSC staff, with the apparent support from the Vice President, were still proceeding as though nothing had happened. Congress was being misled now, a month and a half after the revelation first appeared. What was worse, Deputy Secretary of State John Whitehead said, the CIA has told the Iranians that the State Department is just a temporary impediment, and that after it calms down, ranking CIA agents Cave and Secord will be back in action. The President is being ripped to pieces, and the CIA is reassuring the Iranians. Funny how the conservative Reaganomic Shultz ended up with the same analysis of CIA state relations as Kennedy's liberal Schlesinger. He was one of the first Republicans who had the guts to call for drug legalization, so as simply to bankrupt the drug gangs, thus depriving them of their military clout. On June 8, 1998, Shultz added his signature to that of Kofi Annan, Paul Volcker, George Soros, George Papandreou, Nicholas Katzenbach, Alan Cranston, Claiborne Pell, Raymond Kendall, the Secretary General of Interpol, and countless others, asserting in the New York Times that we believe the global war on drugs is now causing more harm than drug abuse itself. Operation Cyclone was the code name for the CIA program to arm and finance the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, 1979 to 89. The bank used to finance the Contras, BCCI, was one of the major tools used to finance the Mujahideen. Early in 1986, Pakistani Army Major Zahiruddin Afridi was arrested driving to Karachi from Peshawar with 220 kilos of pure Snow White No. 4 heroin. 2 months later, Air Force Flight Lieutenant Khalilur Rahman was intercepted with exactly the same load. He said it was his 5th mission. The heroin was converted Afghan opium, delivered to Pakistani refineries by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's collection system. As the Washington Post reported in 1990, Hekmatyar commanders close to Pakistani military intelligence ISI run laboratories in southwest Pakistan. The retail value of the 2 intercepted loads alone, at least 600 million, was equivalent to a full year's worth of U.S. foreign aid to Pakistan. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is the founder and active leader of the Hezb-e-Islami political party, a designated global terrorist by the United States. His network was a major source of bin Laden's power, and he is still a major force in Afghanistan today, thanks to the artificial value our prohibition gives his opium. Professor McCoy, drawing from Pakistani sources, estimates that by 1988 there were as many as 200 ISI-connected heroin refineries in the Khyber district alone. ISI arms trucks from their National Logistics Cell delivered CIA arms from Karachi to all points on the Afghan border. Those trucks, protected from police search by their Pakistani ISI papers, often returned loaded with heroin from Hekmatyar's rural refineries. Of 40 major heroin syndicates identified by DEA agents operating out of Pakistan and Afghanistan during the 1980s, not one was busted by Pakistani enforcement. In July of 1989, the newly elected Benazir Bhutto went after the ISI. She arrested General Faisal Haq, the former governor of the Northwest Frontier, in effect Hekmatyar's commanding officer. His personal fortune was estimated at several $billions. Benazir Bhutto, of course, got a reply from the ISI in 2007. But it's funny, an Afridi chief told a reporter from the Financial Times in 1989, that the CIA are using the very people that the State Department are trying to stop. All these Western aid projects have helped opium production in Afghanistan, and the Americans have produced a new incentive, offering bribes to those who destroy their crops. They don't learn. They tried that in Pakistan and production went up. The Afridi chief himself ran numerous heroin refineries. The civil war now raging throughout Afghanistan and in Tajikistan, which has devastated the local economies, has left traditional opium as one of the few commodities farmers can rely on to feed their families. That gives Hekmatyar his political support. Today's propagandist-in-chief, emeritus, is Joseph Califano, a key CIA operative both before and after Kennedy's assassination, Carter's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and founder of Columbia University's Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, CASA. Califano helps to channel a torrent of public money into 1930s-style politicized research and coercive treatment. Califano's CASA was one of drug czar McCaffrey's major tools for coordinating national drug propaganda during the Clinton administration. Joe Trento, in the Wilmington News Journal, 11081, Califano and Haig worked hand in hand in keeping the nationalists from the Cuban Brigade happy. They even checked out potential members for the hit teams with older members of the Cuban Brigade. This was confirmed by both Ricardo Canet, a leading member of the hit teams, and by a top official of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who was Haig's Marine liaison in 1963-64. Califano reported directly to Secretary of the Army Cyrus Vance. The older members of the Cuban Brigade Califano and Haig were so concerned to keep happy included the hardcore of Santos Traficante's Batistiano assassins, the former leaders of Batista's secret police. When the Cuba operation ended, military intelligence sent Joe Califano to the White House as Johnson's advisor. Califano was the key to understanding the drug propaganda, not only by virtue of his intentional sophistry, but by virtue of his covert relationships. Is it a coincidence that a high-level CIA agent who helped run Santos Traficante's dope-dealing assassins became the country's leading anti-drug propagandist? I don't think so. The centers of power responsible for dealing the drugs are the same centers of power disseminating the artificial hysteria necessary for their continued criminalization. That keeps the retail price 100 times higher than the natural value and the trade exclusively in the hands of the muscle. Another name for the muscle is military intelligence. The Center for Consumer Freedom emphasizes that CASA has virtually always refused to submit its reports to peer review, which is not the way real science operates. Without peer review, a political report full of erroneous and misleading statistics can be passed off as scientific fact. That's CASA's methodology. As the Washington Times put it, CASA has a proven disdain for the facts. For Califano, all drug use is a disease, an epidemic, to use his words, which, not so coincidentally, are the same as those used by the Pope in 1484 in the Malleus Maleficarum about witches' medicines. Like so many Roman lawyers before him, the man is a genuine anthropological ignoramus. Not once in the pseudo-scientific Radical Surgery, 1994, does he mention the origins of human inebriative behavior, tribal culture, or a single significant pharmacologist, anthropologist, ethnobotanist, or psychoanalyst. Although he insists that substance abuse and addiction is the most devastating health pandemic threatening our people. There's not a single scholarly annotation in the whole book, which is committee written on a 10th grade soundbite level. In fact, he quotes prosecuting attorneys as anecdotal medical authorities. According to Califano, the absurd artificial value prohibition gives inebriants and the criminalization of people for simply trying to medicate themselves in the absence of any sympathetic curanderismo isn't the cause of today's street war. It's the act of self-medication per se, despite the fact that the leading sociologists insist and can prove that safe herbal inebriants in cultures which teach their traditional uses cause no social problems whatever and are in fact healthful, which is why they become traditional. Califano will wring his hands about collegiate binge drinking and never once mention an empirical expert on alcoholism. His idea of an expert is the president of one of the nation's top Jesuit colleges. His discussion of the Rodney King story never once mentions the ruthless police beating of a helpless man to within an inch of his life. It was their acquittal, of course, despite that incredible videotape, that set off the 1992 Los Angeles riots. But Califano never mentions the beating, which so many felt symbolized their own experience. Instead, he focuses on King's drinking, concluding that months later, after the policeman's acquittal, the riots began, not at the courthouse or at City Hall, but at Payless Liquor and Deli in South Central LA. There, around 4 p.m., 5 angry gang members stole some bottles of malt liquor, yelling, "This is for Rodney King." Around 6 p.m., an angry mob, pelting passing motorists, chose its first target for looting, Tom's Liquor Store, from which the mob took more than 100 cases of 40-ounce malt liquor bottles and 90 cases of 16-ounce malt liquor cans. The focus of the crowd should not be a surprise. As U.S. News and World Report noted, 728 licensed liquor outlets smothered South Central LA's crumbling landscape, an opportunity to buy booze around just about every corner. As the 1910 temperance play The Nigger put it, "Why, day before yesterday I had a count made, and there were 3,467 idle niggers in the 59 saloons of the Levee District. That was the end, Cliff, and the long and the short of it is, we're going dry." Califano repeats, as if it were a medical prescription, the Bush-Bennett National Drug Control Strategy. That doesn't mean we should soften up the toughness required to get them to quit, such as threat of dismissal from a job or incarceration upon repeated relapse or violation of drug laws. Just what an addictive personality needs: the stress of unemployment and the threat of incarceration. That's sure to promote sobriety. However one defines addiction, I know of no physician who thinks denial of painkillers to those in pain, or imprisoning diabetics and denying them insulin, is medically indicated. Holland now has less than 1/7 our rate of hard drug use and crime. By refusing to distinguish herbs from concentrates, Califano is actually engineering widespread concentrate use. And that, like it or not, is an historical function of military fascism, which has always been financed by organized crime. If vulnerable people stop being sent to prison for nonviolent drug offenses, the privatized prison industry would go bankrupt. All urban police departments, even if they won't mention the tension they bring to the situation, stress that it's the economics of prohibition, the artificial underground economy, combined with the lack of opportunity that is responsible for the gang warfare, not pharmacology per se. Former Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke, a former police officer, drug traffickers kill to protect or seize drug turf, and addicts commit crimes to get money for drugs. Almost half the murders in Baltimore in 1992 were drug-related. When we say drug-related, explains Deputy Raymond Kelly of the New York City Police Department, we're essentially talking about territorial disputes or disputes over possession. We're not talking about where somebody is deranged because they're on a drug. Califano and his clone McCaffrey were careful to invert this, insisting, in classic reefer madness style, that by some demonic magic, pharmacology is the reason poor kids are shooting each other over dealing territory. Collapse the price with legalization, and the violence will collapse instantly. By creating an underground economy and then demonizing the normal money-seeking and ecstatic behavior of the young, we instigate their murder. As Eddie Engelsman, the former Dutch Minister of Health, puts it, the effects of heroin and cocaine use are too often confused with the effects of their illegality. Herb legalization and medicalized concentrate dispensation would also give the campesinos a legal market for, and deflate the price of, their most valuable crops. Crop substitution would then make some economic sense. End of drug war. But does global military intelligence really want the great boondoggle to end? Drug czar Barry McCaffrey was relieved in December of 1996 at the appointment of a career army officer, General Jose de Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, rather than another corrupt politician, to head the Mexican National Institute for Combating Drugs, the INCD. General Gutierrez, said McCaffrey, has a reputation of impeccable integrity, and he is known as an extremely forceful and focused commander. On February 19, 1997, after less than 3 months on the job, General Gutierrez was relieved of his INCD command and formally charged with being on the payroll of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Mexico's Lord of the Skies. Carrillo, a relative of the Medellin cartel's Jorge Ochoa, had pioneered the use of low-flying jetliners to transport multi-ton loads of cocaine from his Colombian partners to Mexico. A power for years under Salinas, Carrillo did this from his position within Mexican military intelligence. He carried Mexican Federal Judicial Police Group Chief credentials for special investigations and an officer's gold card. Lucindo Carrillo, cousin of Amado, was also un jefe de grupo de PJF in Agua Prieta, Sonora, a port. The PJF commandant in Agua Prieta was also a documented associate of Amado Carrillo. General Gutierrez, one of the most powerful men in Mexican military intelligence, and his 2 top military aides were also formally charged with stacking the INCD with Carrillo's agents. Before he was relieved of command, Gutierrez had been given repeated top-secret briefings on all Mexican-American anti-smuggling efforts, including definitive lists of the INCD DEA's paid Mexican informants. The Lord of the Skies might as well have been personally briefed by Barry McCaffrey himself. The head of the DEA, Thomas Constantine, said General Gutierrez probably would prove more damaging to the DEA than Aldrich Ames had been to the CIA. "Aw, shucks," said Barry. "I didn't know." DEA spokesman James McGivney backed McCaffrey up. "It's not our job to vet these people. We don't go around spooking military and government officials. We've got enough to do with the crooks." Pollyanna is running the DEA? Am I supposed to believe that the premier counterinsurgency expert of the vast U.S. Southern Command naval, air, radar, and information system just ain't too good at this intelligence stuff? General Gutierrez narcotics trafficking was well covered in the DEA's NATIS database long before McCaffrey hailed him as Mexico's salvation at the head of the INCD. On February 18, 1997, Mexican Defense Secretary Cervantes announced that Gutierrez had systematically supported the Carrillo cartel for 7 years. As head of the U.S. Southern Command, 1994 to 96, General McCaffrey worked with Gutierrez for some of those years. It is interesting that while the DEA pegged Gutierrez correctly, the CIA profile was solid McCaffrey's. As one disgusted DEA agent put it, none other than Dennis Dale, 1978 to 82 chief of CENTAC, the DEA's highly effective international strike force. In my 30-year history in the Drug Enforcement Administration and related agencies, the major targets of my investigations almost invariably turned out to be working for the CIA. Dale turned to novelist and reporter James Mills to advertise this. The result was Mills' The Underground Empire, Where Crime and Governments Embrace. Dale's effectiveness was a major reason the Reagan administration underfunded the DEA and put it under FBI control. The drug war is a fascist protection racket, a Reichstag fire, designed to justify sucking as much of the public purse as possible into the military police prison complex, the Republican base, by doing what slavers have always done, criminalize normal human behavior. It is a vast, unnecessary imprisonment for profit system which destroys the lives of hundreds of thousands of young people annually, designed to legally define human beings as industrial machinery. The Taliban don't exist without the artificial value our prohibition gives their opium, as Gretchen Peters has shown in Seeds of Terror. Our brave and competent people, most of whom really do want to help Afghanistan toward real democracy, are forced to support regional drug gangs because our prohibition makes opium the basis of military power throughout Afghanistan. Holland's decades-long decriminalization of pot and medicalization of hard drugs has produced a lower pot use rate than the U.S. has, and a fraction of the hard drug use and street crime rate. Since it prefers to finance physicians rather than drug gangs, Holland has radically reduced prohibition-related crime. Colorado's recent legalization of pot has shown the same results. The USA has the highest imprisonment rate in the world, 743 per 100,000. Netherlands ranks 148th, with 82 per 100,000. That is, the pragmatic Dutch, who have always punched above their weight, spend 85% less on crime than we do. That would translate to a savings of hundreds of billions of dollars annually for the United States. So if strategic success in the drug war can be so easily demonstrated, why aren't we simply copying the Dutch model? Why can't rationality rule? Because the inquisitorial neurosis, upon which almost all the fascist drug propaganda is based, is unconscious. Neurosis, emotional compulsion ruling conscious behavior, is insusceptible to rationality. It is this inquisitorial neurosis, hostility to tribal culture, that Roman slave state culture has bequeathed us, that makes the drug war such an easy sell for the military police prison complex. The drug war is a propaganda-fed repeat of the medieval Inquisition. I don't mean that metaphorically. The most common evidentiary bust of the medieval Inquisition was the possession of prohibited substances. In fact, the legal phrase prohibited substance can be found in the Malleus Maleficarum of 1484, the Church's official legal handbook of the Inquisition, in relation to the witches' medicines of the midwives. Possession, one of the premier indicia of witchcraft, was the most common evidentiary bust of the Inquisition. Today's propaganda barrage is an updated duplicate of that slaver propaganda.